A gunshot pierced the stillness of the Montana twilight in 1878, causing Nathaniel Keller to jerk his head toward the weathered barn at the edge of the Beaumont property. The young rancher's blood ran cold when a woman's scream followed, desperate and terrified in the fading light. Without hesitation, he spurred his Palomino forward, dust billowing behind as they raced across the field. Nathaniel had been riding the boundary of his own modest ranch when he heard the commotion from the neighboring property, a place he'd deliberately avoided since its new owner, the infamous Clayton Reynolds, had arrived 6 months earlier with rumors of cruelty following him like vultures. The screams grew more frantic as Nathaniel approached the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. Leaping from his horse, he drew his Colt revolver and rushed to the barn door. It was barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam, a discovery that sent a chill down his spine. Who would lock someone inside? Another scream tore through the air, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a man's angry shout. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He holstered his gun, wrapped his strong hands around the beam, and with a surge of adrenaline, tore it away from the door. The ancient hinges groaned in protest as he flung the door open, revealing the dim interior of the barn. "She's free now," Nathaniel declared boldly, his voice echoing through the cavernous space as his eyes adjusted to the shadows. What he saw made his stomach turn. A young woman with honey blonde hair was backed against a stall, her dress torn at the shoulder, a thin trail of blood running down her temple. Clayton Reynolds stood between them, a broken whiskey bottle in his hand and fury in his bloodshot eyes. "This ain't your business, Keller," Reynolds snarled, his words slurred from drink. "Get off my property." "I'm not leaving without her," Nathaniel replied, his hand hovering near his holster. The woman Nora Beaumont, he realized with a shock, stared at him with wide, desperate eyes. He'd heard that old man Beaumont had died, and his daughter had returned from back east, but he hadn't laid eyes on her since they were children. Now here she was, terrified and trapped with this monster who had somehow acquired her family's ranch. Reynolds lunged forward unexpectedly, the jagged bottle aimed at Nathaniel's chest. Years of breaking wild horses had honed the cowboy's reflexes. He sidestepped the attack, grabbed Reynolds' wrist, and twisted until the bottle clattered to the ground. A swift punch to the jaw sent the drunk man sprawling into the hay. "Miss Beaumont," Nathaniel said, not taking his eyes off Reynolds. "Can you ride?" She nodded, wiping blood from her face with a trembling hand. "Yes." "Then let's go. My horse is outside." Reynolds was already struggling to his feet, cursing and reaching for something in his boot. Nathaniel didn't wait to see what it was. He took Nora's hand and they ran for the door, emerging into the dusky evening air. Behind them, a gunshot rang out, splintering wood near Nathaniel's head as they mounted his Palomino. "Hold tight," he instructed as Nora wrapped her arms around his waist. He felt her body shaking against his back as they galloped away from the barn, away from Reynolds and his threats that faded into the distance. Only when they were safely across the creek that separated the two properties did Nathaniel slow the horse to a walk. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Thank you," Nora whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "He would have killed me." Nathaniel felt her forehead press against his back, her tears dampening his shirt. "You're safe now, Miss Beaumont. I promise you that." What neither of them knew as they rode toward Nathaniel's ranch house in the gathering darkness was that this night would be the beginning of a love story that would become legend in Silver Creek Valley. What began with screams in a barn would evolve into something neither could have imagined, a bond forged in danger and cultivated in the wild landscape of Montana Territory, where courage and heart were the only currency that truly mattered. The light from Nathaniel's modest ranch house beckoned through the twilight as they approached. It wasn't grand like the Beaumont place had once been, but it was sturdy and welcoming, a testament to the 4 years of backbreaking work he'd put into building his own spread after returning from the war. "Miss Beaumont, we're here," he said softly, realizing her grip around his waist had slackened. He helped her dismount, catching her as her knees buckled. "Easy now." In the lamplight that spilled from the porch, he could see her face clearly for the first time since the barn. A purple bruise was forming around her left eye, and the cut at her temple still oozed blood. Her bottom lip was split, and anger surged through him at the sight. "Let's get you inside and tend to those wounds," he said, guiding her up the steps. His housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, a kindly widow who lived in the small cabin behind the main house, appeared in the doorway with wide eyes. "Merciful heavens! What's happened?" "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Nora Beaumont." "She needs our help," Nathaniel explained, leading Nora to the sofa near the stone fireplace. "Could you bring hot water and bandages?" "Of course, right away," the older woman replied, hurrying to fulfill his request. Nora sat stiffly, her eyes downcast and her hands clenched in her lap. Now that they were in the safety of his home, Nathaniel noticed other details. Her fine dress, despite the tears and dirt, spoke of Eastern sophistication. Her hands, though scratched and reddened, showed signs of a genteel upbringing with their slender fingers and neat nails. "I apologize for the state of things," Nathaniel said, suddenly aware of his humble surroundings. "I don't often have visitors, especially not women running from violent men," Nora finished for him, a flicker of spirit showing through her exhaustion. He smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "I was going to say ladies from back east, but yes, that too." Mrs. Abernathy returned with a basin of steaming water, clean cloths, and a small bottle of whiskey. "For the wounds," she explained, setting everything on the table. "I'll make some tea and heat up the stew from supper." As the housekeeper bustled away, Nathaniel dampened a cloth and gently reached toward Nora's face. She flinched instinctively. "I'm sorry," he said, withdrawing his hand. "Would you prefer Mrs. Abernathy to help you?" Nora took a deep breath and shook her head. "No, I'm sorry, you can. You can help me." With careful movements, Nathaniel cleaned the cut on her temple. "What happened at the barn, Miss Beaumont? How did Reynolds come to be at your family's ranch?" Tears welled in her eyes. "He claimed my father owed him money, that he'd purchased the ranch before father died." Her voice strengthened with indignation. "It's a lie. My father would never sell to a man like Reynolds. I came back from Boston after receiving word of father's passing to find that monster living in our house, claiming everything was his." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he applied whiskey to the cloth and warned her, "This will sting." When she nodded, he carefully dabbed at the cut, wincing in sympathy as she sucked in a sharp breath. "I remember your father as an honorable man. He helped me purchase my land when I came back from the war with nothing but scars and nightmares." "You fought?" Nora asked, seeming eager to focus on something other than her pain. "Union cavalry. Not something folks around here like to be reminded of, but your father didn't hold it against me." A small smile flickered across her face. "That sounds like him. Always judging people by their character, not their circumstances." Mrs. Abernathy returned with a tray bearing 2 steaming mugs and bowls of hearty beef stew. "Eat, both of you. Nothing helps healing like a full stomach." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the simple food more comforting than any fancy restaurant meal could have been under the circumstances. When Nora had eaten about half her bowl, she set it aside and looked directly at Nathaniel for the first time. "What am I to do now, Mr. Keller?" Reynolds will surely come looking for me. He's been. She faltered, becoming more aggressive each day. Tonight was the worst. He'd been drinking heavily and accused me of stealing documents from his desk. When I denied it, he... Her voice broke. "You can stay here," Nathaniel said firmly. "The guest room is small but comfortable. Tomorrow we'll ride into town and speak with Sheriff Wilson. Your father was well respected in Silver Creek. People won't stand for Reynolds taking what's rightfully yours." Nora's exhaustion was evident in the droop of her shoulders and the shadows beneath her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy gently took her arm. "Come, dear. Let's get you settled for the night. I have a nightgown that might be a bit large but will serve until we can retrieve your things." After they left, Nathaniel sat by the fire, turning his hat in his hands as he considered the situation. Reynolds was dangerous, more so than most knew. Rumors circulated that he'd killed men in Texas and New Mexico before drifting north to Montana. Why he'd set his sights on the Beaumont ranch was a mystery, but Nathaniel suspected there was more to it than a supposed debt. He was still deep in thought when Mrs. Abernathy returned. "She's asleep, poor thing, exhausted to the bone and afraid to close her eyes." The housekeeper fixed him with a knowing look. "You've stepped into something dangerous, Nathaniel." "I know," he admitted. "But what choice did I have? Leave her there with that animal. No choice at all for a man like you," she said with approval. "Just be careful. Men like Reynolds don't forget slights, and he'll see your interference as more than a slight." Nathaniel nodded, his mind already working through what needed to be done. "Tomorrow I'll take her to town, get the sheriff involved. We'll sort this out proper and legal. And tonight I'll keep watch. Reynolds might be drunk, but he's not stupid. He might come looking." Mrs. Abernathy patted his shoulder. "I'll make coffee before I head to my cabin. It's going to be a long night." After she left, Nathaniel checked his revolver, added wood to the fire, and settled into the chair facing the door. Outside, the Montana night deepened, stars emerging like diamond dust scattered across the vast black sky. In the guest room down the hall, Nora Beaumont slept fitfully, while her unexpected protector maintained his vigil, determined that no harm would come to her under his roof. As the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, Nathaniel stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the land awaken. He dozed intermittently throughout the night, alert to every sound, but Reynolds hadn't appeared. Perhaps the man had been too drunk to mount a pursuit, or maybe he was biding his time, planning his next move. Either way, Nathaniel knew the respite was temporary. The sound of the door opening behind him drew his attention. Nora stood in the doorway, dressed in the same torn dress from the previous night, though she'd made attempts to mend it. Her hair was neatly braided, and she'd washed her face, but the bruises stood out starkly against her fair skin. "Good morning, Mr. Keller," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. "Mrs. Abernathy said you've been keeping watch all night." Nathaniel tipped his hat slightly. "Miss Beaumont, did you manage to get some rest?" "Some," she admitted, stepping out to join him on the porch. "Though my dreams were unpleasant." He offered her his coffee, which she accepted gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around the warm mug. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I'd forgotten how beautiful Montana mornings could be." "How long were you in Boston?" Nathaniel asked. "Almost 8 years. Father sent me to live with my aunt after Mother died. He wanted me to get a proper education." A sad smile touched her lips. "We wrote letters every week. When they suddenly stopped coming, I knew something was wrong. By the time I received word of his death and made arrangements to return, Reynolds was already established at the ranch." "How long have you been back?" 3 weeks. At first, Reynolds was Accommodating, said I could stay while I sorted through Father's affairs. But when I started asking questions about the supposed sale, he changed. She shuddered. He's been drinking more, watching me constantly. Yesterday I found some papers in his desk drawer, letters between him and someone named Hargrove discussing mineral rights on our land. When he caught me, Nathaniel's interest sharpened. Mineral rights. There's never been anything valuable found on Beaumont land that I know of. The letters mentioned something called black gold and striking it rich enough to make Rockefeller jealous. Oil, Nathaniel breathed. They must think there's oil on your property. Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Breakfast is ready. Come eat before it gets cold. Over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy, they discussed their plan for the day. Nathaniel would take Nora into Silver Creek to speak with Sheriff Wilson and Mr. Patterson, the town's only lawyer. If Reynolds had truly purchased the ranch, there would be documentation filed with the county. I should fetch some of my things first, Nora suggested. I can't keep wearing this torn dress, and I have Father's papers hidden in my room. Nathaniel frowned. It's too dangerous to go back there directly. Reynolds will be waiting. Then what do you suggest? There was a challenge in her voice that made him smile despite the gravity of the situation. We'll circle around to the back of the property. There's an old trail through the woods that comes up behind the orchard. Your father showed it to me years ago. He stood, decision made. Mrs. Abernathy, could you pack some food for us? We might be gone most of the day. An hour later, they were mounted and ready to leave, Nathaniel on his Palomino and Nora on Mrs. Abernathy's gentle mare. Nora wore a borrowed shirt and trousers from Mrs. Abernathy's late husband, cinched tight with a belt. The clothes were too large, but more practical for riding than her torn dress. You look like a proper Western woman now, Nathaniel commented as they set off. Nora laughed, the sound unexpectedly musical. My Boston finishing school would be scandalized. Miss Harrington always said a lady should never show her ankles, let alone parade around in men's trousers. Miss Harrington clearly never had to ride 15 miles to town through Montana countryside, Nathaniel replied with a smile. They rode at a steady pace, taking a roundabout route to avoid being spotted from the main road. Nathaniel found himself watching Nora with growing admiration. Despite her Eastern education and the trauma of the previous night, she rode confidently and didn't complain about the rough terrain or the early morning chill. You ride well, he observed as they paused at a stream to water the horses. Father insisted I learn before he sent me east. Said no daughter of his would grow up unable to handle a horse properly. Pride and grief mingled in her voice. He taught me to shoot, too, though I'm sure I'm terribly out of practice. We can remedy that if you're staying in Montana, Nathaniel said, then hesitated. Are you planning to stay? Even if we resolve this situation with Reynolds, Nora gazed across the stream, her expression thoughtful. I don't know. I came back intending to sell the ranch and return to Boston. I have a position teaching at a girls' school there. She sighed. But being back, seeing the land again. It stirs something in me I thought I'd forgotten. They remounted and continued their journey, the conversation turning to memories of Silver Creek in earlier days. Nathaniel told her about his time in the war, how he joined up at 17, lying about his age, and returned 4 years later with nightmares that still sometimes woke him. Nora spoke of Boston, the restrictive society that never quite felt like home despite her aunt's best efforts. By mid-morning they had circled around to approach the Beaumont Ranch from the north, through a dense stand of pines that provided cover. They dismounted at the edge of the trees, tethering the horses securely. We'll go on foot from here, Nathaniel said, checking his revolver. Stay close and move quietly. The old trail was barely visible now, overgrown with brush, but Nathaniel remembered the way. They crept through the woods, alert for any sign of Reynolds or his men. When the orchard came into view, they paused behind a large oak to survey the area. The Beaumont Ranch house stood about 200 yards away, a handsome two-story structure built by Nora's grandfather in the 1840s. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney, but there was no other sign of activity. The barn where Nathaniel had found Nora the previous night was to the left, its doors now closed. "I don't see anyone," Nora whispered. "Reynolds has 2 men working for him, brothers named Tate and Turner Dixon, mean-spirited men who follow him like loyal dogs." "Let's wait a few minutes, make sure they're not just inside," Nathaniel suggested. They didn't have to wait long. After about 10 minutes, a rider emerged from behind the barn, a burly man with a red beard whom Nora identified as Tate Dixon. He mounted a dappled gray horse and rode off toward the main road, heading in the direction of town. "He's probably going to look for me," Nora said, her voice tight with tension. "All the more reason to hurry." "Where's your room?" "Second floor, east side." "There's a trellis with a climbing rose that leads almost to my window." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Used that route often, did you?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. "A young lady needs her secrets, Mr. Keller." They made their way through the orchard, keeping low among the apple trees. As they neared the house, a dog began barking, a large black and tan hound that came bounding around the corner. "Samson!" Nora exclaimed in a hushed voice. "He's my father's hunting dog." The dog recognized her immediately, his barking changing to excited whines as he rushed to greet her. Nora knelt to embrace the animal, whispering soothing words as he licked her face enthusiastically. "He'll give us away," Nathaniel warned, eyeing the house warily. "Samson, hush now," Nora commanded, and to Nathaniel's surprise the dog immediately quieted, though his tail continued to wag furiously. "He'll stay with us. Father trained him well." With the dog padding silently beside them, they approached the east side of the house. The rose trellis Nora had mentioned was still there, though the roses had been neglected and were growing wild. Nathaniel tested it with his weight. "It will hold," he decided. "I'll go first, then help you up." "I can manage," Nora insisted. "I've climbed it hundreds of times." Before he could protest, she was scaling the trellis with practiced ease, the borrowed trousers making the climb easier than it would have been in skirts. Nathaniel followed, impressed by her agility and determination. The window at the top was unlatched, just as Nora had hoped. She slipped inside, with Nathaniel close behind. They found themselves in a charming bedroom that, despite Reynolds' occupation of the house, remained distinctly feminine. A 4-poster bed with a faded quilt stood against one wall, a writing desk beneath the window, and a wardrobe of dark oak against another wall. "Reynolds hasn't touched this room much," Nora observed, moving quickly to the wardrobe. "He keeps to my father's room and the study downstairs." She pulled a carpet bag from beneath the bed and began filling it with essentials: a few dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a framed photograph of her parents that stood on the bedside table. From a hiding place behind a loose board in the wardrobe, she retrieved a small box. "My father's important papers," she explained. "Birth certificates, deeds, bank documents." She opened it briefly, rifling through the contents. "The deed to the ranch is here, and there's no record of any sale to Reynolds." A sound from downstairs made them both freeze, the heavy tread of boots on wooden floors, followed by a man's voice calling out, "Turner, get the horses saddled. We're riding into town to find that Keller bastard and the girl, Reynolds." Nora's face paled, but she moved with purpose, stuffing the box into her bag and fastening it quickly. Nathaniel drew his revolver and moved to the door, listening intently. He could hear Reynolds moving around downstairs, the clink of a bottle against glass suggesting he was already drinking despite the early hour. "We need to go," Nathaniel whispered. "Now." They returned to the window, Nathaniel going first this time so he could help Nora down. The descent was more difficult with the carpet bag, but they managed it without incident. Once on the ground, they crept back toward the orchard, Samson following obediently. They had almost reached the cover of the trees when the back door of the house slammed open. Turner Dixon stood on the porch, a shotgun in his hands, his eyes scanning the property. By some stroke of luck, he was looking toward the barn rather than the orchard. "Stay here," Nathaniel murmured, easing Nora behind a large apple tree. "If anything happens, run for the horses and ride for town." Before she could protest, he was moving stealthily around the perimeter of the orchard, approaching the house from a different angle. His plan was simple: create a distraction that would allow Nora to escape safely with her belongings. He picked up a rock and threw it hard against the side of the barn. The sound drew Turner's attention immediately. The man whirled, raising his shotgun and moving cautiously toward the barn. As soon as he was far enough from the house, Nathaniel signaled to Nora to run for the woods. She darted from tree to tree, clutching her carpetbag with Samson at her heels. Nathaniel watched until she reached the edge of the woods before he threw another rock, this time against the window of the house. Glass shattered, and Reynolds' angry voice bellowed from inside. Turner spun around, confused by the sounds coming from different directions. In the moment of confusion, Nathaniel slipped away, racing toward the woods where Nora waited. A shotgun blast tore through the air, pellets peppering the trees around him as Turner finally spotted his movement. Nathaniel ducked and weaved, adrenaline pushing him faster as another shot followed the first. He reached the tree line with Reynolds' curses echoing behind him. Nora grabbed his arm, her face tight with fear. "Are you hit?" "No, just winded. Let's go." They ran through the woods to where their horses waited, Samson bounding alongside them. Behind them, they could hear Reynolds and Turner crashing through the orchard in pursuit. They mounted quickly, Nora securing her bag to the saddle. "What about Samson?" she asked, hesitating. "He'll follow," Nathaniel assured her. "We need to move." They spurred their horses forward, taking a different trail than the one they'd arrived on. This path led west, away from town but also away from Reynolds. They could circle back toward Silver Creek once they'd lost their pursuers. For nearly an hour, they rode hard through the wilderness, crossing streams and navigating rough terrain that would be difficult to follow. Samson kept pace admirably, occasionally ranging ahead as if scouting the path. Finally, when the horses needed rest, they stopped in a small clearing beside a bubbling creek. "You think we lost them?" Nora asked, breathless from the ride. Nathaniel dismounted and helped her down. "For now. Reynolds knows these hills, though. He won't give up easily." "At least I have the deed," Nora said, patting her carpetbag, "and my father's other papers. With these, we can prove Reynolds is lying about owning the ranch." Nathaniel nodded, a thought occurring to him. "That might be why he locked you in the barn. If he found out you had discovered those documents in his desk, he might have been planning to get rid of you." A shudder passed through Nora, and she wrapped her arms around herself. "I believe you're right. The way he looked at me last night." She couldn't finish the thought. Nathaniel wanted to comfort her but wasn't sure how. He settled for practical matters. "We should eat something before continuing to town. Mrs. Abernathy packed enough for a small army." They shared bread, cheese, and dried beef, sitting on a fallen log beside the creek. Samson lay at Nora's feet, occasionally lifting his head when she offered him a morsel of food. The peaceful setting was a stark contrast to the danger they'd just escaped. "Tell me about your ranch," Nora said as they ate. "Father mentioned in his letters that you were doing well, building something substantial." Pride warmed Nathaniel's voice as he described his modest, spread the 100 acres of good grazing land, the small herd of cattle he was building, the 2-quarter horses he was training to sell. "It's not much compared to your family's ranch, but it's mine. No debts, no partners." "It sounds wonderful," Nora said sincerely. "Independence is something to be proud of. What about you? Is teaching what you always wanted to do?" She considered the question, absent-mindedly stroking Samson's head. "I enjoy it. The girls are eager to learn, and it's satisfying to help shape young minds." A wistful note entered her voice. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm merely doing what's expected of a woman in my position rather than what truly calls to my heart." "And what does call to your heart, Miss Beaumont?" Nathaniel asked softly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood the value of freedom and self-determination. Before Nora could answer, Samson suddenly raised his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Nathaniel was instantly alert. "Someone's coming." They quickly packed up their food and doused the small fire they'd built. Leading the horses deeper into the trees, they concealed themselves behind a dense thicket of brush. Nathaniel drew his revolver, and Nora kept a firm hand on Samson's collar to keep him quiet. Minutes later, 2 riders passed nearby, not Reynolds or his men, but strangers heading toward Silver Creek. Once they were gone, Nathaniel and Nora emerged from their hiding place. "We should keep moving," Nathaniel said. "It'll be safer to approach town from the south, even though it's longer." They rode at a more measured pace now, conserving the horses' strength. The day had warmed considerably, the late May sun high overhead. As they traveled, they talked more freely, sharing stories of their lives. Nathaniel told her about his dream of breeding horses, while Nora spoke of her interest in writing, confessing she'd published several stories in ladies' magazines under a pen name. "My aunt would have been scandalized if she knew," Nora said with a laugh. "She believes a lady should only write letters and perhaps the occasional poem for family consumption." "What do you write about?" Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious. A blush colored her cheeks. "Adventures, mostly. Women who explore uncharted territories or solve mysteries." "My editor says they're quite popular with young lady readers who dream of lives beyond parlors and drawing rooms." "Sounds like you're writing what calls to your heart after all," Nathaniel observed. By mid-afternoon, they had circled around to approach Silver Creek from the south. The town had grown substantially since Nora had left for Boston, now boasting several streets of businesses, a schoolhouse, 2 churches, and even a small hotel. As they rode down Main Street, several people stared at the unusual sight, a woman in men's clothing riding alongside Nathaniel Keller, a large dog trotting beside them. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office, a small but sturdy building with a sign proclaiming R. Wilson, Sheriff, hanging above the door. Nora quickly pulled a shawl from her bag to drape over her borrowed clothes, making a small attempt at propriety. Sheriff Wilson was a grizzled man in his 50s with a salt and pepper mustache and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from his desk as they entered, recognition dawning on his weathered face. "Miss Beaumont. Good Lord, girl, is that you? And Keller?" He stood, taking in Nora's bruised face and unusual attire. "What in tarnation happened to you?" Over the next hour, they explained everything Reynolds claimed to the ranch, his escalating violence, and the discovery of the letters suggesting oil might be present on Beaumont land. Nora produced the deed to the ranch and her father's other papers, spreading them on the sheriff's desk. "There's no bill of sale, no transfer of deed," she pointed out. Reynolds is lying about purchasing the ranch. Sheriff Wilson examined the documents carefully. This all seems in order, Miss Beaumont. But Reynolds filed papers with Judge Parker claiming your father sold him the ranch for a substantial sum just before his death. He had witnesses the Dixon brothers swore to it. They're lying, Nathaniel stated flatly. Henry Beaumont would never sell to a man like Reynolds. The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. I believe you, but it's your word against theirs. We need more evidence. He eyed the bruises on Nora's face. Though I could arrest Reynolds for assault based on your condition, Miss Beaumont. He'd claim she fell or some such nonsense, Nathaniel said bitterly. And the Dixon brothers would back him up. What about these letters mentioning oil? Sheriff Wilson asked. If Reynolds is trying to steal the ranch because he believes there's oil on the property, that's a powerful motive. Nora's expression brightened. The letters are still in his desk at the ranch, if we could retrieve them. Too dangerous, both men said simultaneously. Besides, the sheriff continued, breaking into the house to steal documents, even if they're evidence of wrongdoing, isn't exactly legal. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Mr. Patterson, the town lawyer, entered, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose and his arms full of ledgers. Sheriff, I heard Miss Beaumont had returned and was asking about her father's. He stopped short when he saw Nora's condition. Good heavens, what happened? After another round of explanations, Patterson sat heavily in a chair, his expression grave. This is most disturbing. I handled your father's affairs for years, Miss Beaumont, and I assure you he never mentioned selling the ranch. In fact, just before his death, he came to see me about ensuring the property would pass smoothly to you. Hope flared in Nora's eyes. You can testify to that. I can, but it might not be enough against forged documents and false witnesses. Patterson tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the ledger in his lap. However, your father did leave something in my safekeeping. He opened the ledger and withdrew an envelope. He asked me to give this to you when you returned, in case anything happened to him. With trembling hands, Nora opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in her father's familiar handwriting and a small key. My dearest Nora, she read aloud, her voice wavering. If you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass. A man named Clayton Reynolds has been making inquiries about our land, particularly the north section where the old mine entrance is located. He claims to have evidence that there is oil beneath our property and has offered to buy the ranch at a price far below its value. I have refused, which has made him increasingly aggressive. If anything should happen to me, do not trust him. The enclosed key opens a strong box hidden beneath the floorboards in my study, under the bearskin rug. Inside, you will find documents proving our ownership and a detailed account of Reynolds' threats. Be careful, my darling girl. Trust Sheriff Wilson and Nathan Keller if you need help. They are honorable men. All my love, Father. Silence fell over the room as Nora finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Wilson was the first to speak. Well, that changes things considerably. Henry suspected foul play and left evidence. He looked at Nora and Nathaniel with newfound determination. We need to get to that strongbox. Patterson adjusted his spectacles. This letter alone is compelling evidence, particularly with Henry naming Reynolds as a potential threat before his death. Reynolds will have searched the study thoroughly, Nathaniel pointed out. If he found the strongbox, the documents could be long gone. Father was clever, Nora said, wiping her tears. The study has a false floor beneath the rug, a hiding place our grandfather built during the early days when raids were common. Few people know about it. Reynolds might have looked under the rug but wouldn't know to check for loose floorboards. Sheriff Wilson stood, strapping on his gun belt with purpose. Then we need to retrieve those documents. I'll deputize you, Keller, to make this official. Patterson, write up a search warrant based on Miss Beaumont's testimony and her father's letter. Within the hour, a plan was formulated. Sheriff Wilson would ride to the Beaumont ranch with Nathaniel, Nora, and 2 trusted deputies. They would present Reynolds with the warrant and search the study for the strongbox. If the documents inside corroborated Henry Beaumont's letter, they would arrest Reynolds immediately. "What about the Dixon brothers?" Nora asked as they prepared to leave. "They won't stand by while you arrest their employer. Deputy Harris will keep them covered," Sheriff Wilson assured her. "And you, Miss Beaumont, will stay behind me and Keller at all times. No heroics." Nathaniel helped Nora mount her horse, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. "Are you sure you want to come? You could wait here in town where it's safe." The determined set of her jaw reminded him forcefully of her father. "It's my home, Mr. Keller. I won't cower in town while others fight my battles." Their small party rode out of Silver Creek as afternoon gave way to early evening. Sampson trotted alongside Nora's horse, occasionally ranging ahead as if scouting the path. The tension was palpable, each rider lost in thought about the confrontation to come. As they crested the final hill overlooking the Beaumont ranch, Sheriff Wilson raised his hand, signaling them to halt. Below, they could see 3 horses saddled and waiting outside the main house. Reynolds and the Dixon brothers were home. "Remember the plan," Wilson said quietly. "We approach openly, present the warrant, and conduct a lawful search. No one draws unless I give the word." They rode down the hill at a measured pace, making no attempt to conceal their approach. Nathaniel positioned himself beside Nora, acutely aware of her vulnerability despite her brave face. As they neared the house, the front door opened and Clayton Reynolds stepped onto the porch, the Dixon brothers flanking him like sentinels. "Well, well," Reynolds called, his voice carrying across the yard. "The prodigal daughter returns, and she's brought the law with her." His eyes narrowed when they landed on Nathaniel. "And her gallant rescuer." Sheriff Wilson dismounted, his deputies following suit. Nathaniel helped Nora down, keeping a protective hand at the small of her back as they approached the house. "Reynolds," the sheriff acknowledged coolly. "We have a warrant to search these premises, specifically the study, for documents relating to the ownership of this property." Reynolds' face darkened. "This is my property, legally purchased. I have the paperwork to prove it." "We'll see about that," Wilson replied, unfolding the warrant and holding it out. "You can examine this if you like, but we're coming in either way." For a tense moment, Reynolds seemed poised to refuse. The Dixon brothers' hands hovered near their holsters, and Nathaniel felt his own muscles tense in anticipation. Then, unexpectedly, Reynolds smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. "By all means, Sheriff, search away. You won't find anything to contradict my claim." He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "The study is at the back of the house." The easy acquiescence was suspicious. As they entered, Nathaniel kept Nora close, his senses alert for any sign of treachery. The house was much as Nora had described it, though signs of neglect were evident in the dusty surfaces and disarray. Reynolds led them to the study, a handsome room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. "The bearskin rug," Nora whispered to Nathaniel, pointing to the floor before the fireplace where a massive grizzly pelt lay spread. Sheriff Wilson nodded to his deputies to keep watch on Reynolds and the Dixons, who had followed them into the room. "Miss Beaumont, would you show us where to look?" Nora knelt beside the rug, pushing it aside to reveal wide plank flooring. Her fingers traced the edges of the boards until she found what she was looking for, a slight gap that allowed her to lift one plank. revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a metal strongbox, exactly as her father had described. The key from the letter fit perfectly. When Nora opened the box, her gasp of relief told them what they needed to know. She pulled out a sheaf of papers, handing them to Sheriff Wilson. "These are records of Reynolds' threats," she explained, "and documentation of my father's refusal to sell. There's also—" Her voice faltered as she lifted another document. A letter dated 2 days before father died, stating that if anything happened to him, it should be investigated as murder, not an accident. All eyes turned to Reynolds, whose confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of trapped fury. In a flash, he drew a concealed derringer from his vest, pointing it directly at Nora. "Nobody move," he snarled. "Drop your guns or I'll kill her where she stands." The room froze. Sheriff Wilson and his deputies had their hands on their weapons but didn't draw. Nathaniel stood rigid, calculating the distance between himself and Reynolds, knowing he couldn't reach the man before he could fire. "Easy now, Reynolds," Sheriff Wilson said calmly. "You're only making things worse for yourself." "Shut up," Reynolds snapped, his eyes wild. "Tate, get their guns." Turner grabbed the strongbox. As Tate Dixon moved toward them, a low growl came from the doorway. Sampson stood there, hackles raised, teeth bared in a snarl. The distraction was slight but enough. Nathaniel lunged, knocking Nora aside as Reynolds fired. The bullet whizzed past, embedding itself in the bookshelf. Chaos erupted. Sampson leaped at Tate Dixon, taking the man down in a flurry of teeth and claws. Sheriff Wilson and his deputies drew their weapons, commanding the others to freeze. Turner Dixon raised his hands in surrender, but Reynolds made a desperate break for the window. Nathaniel was faster. He tackled Reynolds before he could escape, the two men crashing to the floor in a violent struggle. Reynolds was surprisingly strong for his size, desperation lending him power. He landed a solid punch to Nathaniel's jaw, momentarily stunning him. Reynolds scrambled to his feet, reaching for the fallen derringer, but found himself staring down the barrel of Nora's revolver, a small pearl-handled weapon she'd pulled from her carpetbag. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I know how to use this." Reynolds froze, his gaze darting between Nora and the others. Realizing he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, he slowly raised his hands. "It's over, Reynolds," Sheriff Wilson said, moving forward to handcuff him. "You're under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and suspicion in the death of Henry Beaumont." As the deputies secured Reynolds and the Dixon brothers, Nathaniel picked himself up, rubbing his jaw where Reynolds had struck him. Nora lowered her revolver, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked, moving to her side. She nodded, though tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "I can't believe it's over." "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "You showed real courage today." Sheriff Wilson approached, the strongbox tucked securely under his arm. "We'll take these men to town for holding. The judge will want to review all this evidence, but with Henry's written statements and the attempted assault we all witnessed, I'd say Reynolds will be facing serious charges." Nora looked around the study, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "This is really my home again." "Yes, Miss Beaumont," Sheriff Wilson confirmed. "It's yours as it should be." As the sheriff and his deputies escorted the prisoners outside, Nathaniel and Nora remained in the study. Sampson padded over to Nora, nuzzling her hand for reassurance. She scratched behind his ears absently, her gaze distant. "What will you do now?" Nathaniel asked. "Will you return to Boston?" The question seemed to bring her back to the present. She looked around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings that held so many memories. "No," she said finally. I don't think I will. This is where I belong. Outside, the setting sun painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Standing on the porch after the sheriff and his prisoners had departed, Nathaniel and Nora watched the spectacular display in companionable silence. The events of the past 2 days had forged a bond between them that neither quite understood but both felt deeply. Would you? Would you stay for supper, Mr. Keller? Nora asked hesitantly. I'm not much of a cook, but I could manage something simple. Nathaniel smiled, his blue eyes warming as they met hers. I'd be honored, Miss Beaumont, and perhaps you might consider calling me Nathaniel. After all we've been through, Mr. Keller seems overly formal. A slight blush colored her cheeks. Then you must call me Nora. As they turned to enter the house, Nathaniel knew that this moment marked a beginning rather than an end. The danger had passed, but their story was just starting to unfold beneath the vast Montana sky. Over the weeks that followed, Silver Creek buzzed with the scandal of Clayton Reynolds' arrest and the revelations that came to light during his trial. Evidence from Henry Beaumont's strongbox proved not only that Reynolds had threatened him repeatedly, but also suggested foul play in his death. The coroner reopened the case, and upon exhumation and examination, traces of arsenic were found in Henry's remains. Reynolds was charged with murder, and the Dixon brothers turned state's evidence against him in exchange for reduced sentences for their part in the scheme. Throughout the ordeal, Nathaniel remained steadfastly by Nora's side. What had begun as a rescue had evolved into a partnership, as they worked together to restore the Beaumont Ranch to its former glory. The neglect under Reynolds' brief tenure had taken its toll, but with determination and hard work, progress was swift. Nora proved herself more than capable of ranch management, drawing on childhood lessons from her father and a natural aptitude that surprised even herself. She hired a foreman and 2 ranch hands, good men recommended by Sheriff Wilson, and set about learning everything she needed to know to run the operation successfully. Nathaniel visited almost daily, helping with repairs, offering advice on cattle management, and simply providing companionship. Their friendship deepened with each passing day, though neither spoke openly of the growing feelings between them. One warm evening in late June, they sat on the porch after a long day of work, sharing a simple meal as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Samson lay at their feet, occasionally lifting his head to accept a morsel from Nora's plate. The north pasture fence is finished, Nathaniel reported, setting aside his empty plate. Your cattle can be moved there tomorrow to give the east section time to recover. Nora nodded, grateful for his expertise. I don't know how I would have managed all this without your help. You would have found a way, he said with a smile. You're more capable than you give yourself credit for. She laughed softly. Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. Her expression grew more serious. The banker from Helena is coming next week about the oil speculation. Apparently, Reynolds wasn't entirely wrong. There might be deposits on the north corner of the property. What will you do if they confirm it? Nora considered the question, her gaze drifting to the distant mountains. I'm not sure. The money would secure the ranch's future, but I've seen what oil drilling does to the land. She sighed. Father always said we were stewards of this place, not just owners. A wise man, your father. Yes, he was. She turned to face Nathaniel, her expression earnest. What would you do if it were your land? He thought carefully before answering. I'd consider a limited agreement allow them to drill in one specific area, with strict requirements for minimizing damage and restoring the land afterward. Use the proceeds to ensure the ranch remains sustainable for generations to come. She nodded slowly. A compromise. I like that approach. A comfortable silence fell between them before she spoke again. I received a letter from the school in Boston yesterday. They're holding my teaching position until the end of summer, expecting me to return. Nathaniel felt his heart sink, though he kept his expression neutral. Will you go back? I've been asking myself that question since the letter arrived. She set her plate aside and stood, moving to the porch railing to gaze out at the land that had been in her family for generations. Teaching was fulfilling in its way, but being here again. She turned to face him. This is where I feel most alive. Hope flickered in Nathaniel's chest. Then you'll stay. Yes, she said simply. I'm going to write to them tomorrow to resign my position. Without thinking, Nathaniel rose and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. I'm glad, he said softly. Their eyes met in the gathering twilight, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since that fateful night when he'd heard her screams and broken down the barn door. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was tender, tentative at first, then deepening as Nora responded, her hands moving to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their faces flushed in the soft glow of the porch lantern. I've wanted to do that for weeks, Nathaniel admitted, his voice husky. Nora smiled, her eyes shining. I've wanted you to. Their second kiss was more confident, a promise of things to come. As the stars multiplied overhead and night settled fully over the Montana landscape, they talked of future possibilities for themselves, for their ranches, for a life they might build together. Summer gave way to autumn, and the Beaumont Ranch thrived under Nora's careful management. The banker from Helena confirmed moderate oil deposits on the property, and following Nathaniel's advice, Nora negotiated a limited drilling agreement that would protect most of her land while providing financial security. Nathaniel's own ranch prospered as well. His small herd of cattle had grown, and the quarter horses he trained fetched good prices from buyers as far away as Colorado. Still, he found himself spending more time at the Beaumont place than his own, drawn there by the woman who had captured his heart. They courted properly, with chaperone dinners in town and Sunday rides after church. Silver Creek society approved of the match. The respected rancher and the educated Beaumont daughter made a handsome couple, and their story of overcoming Reynolds' villainy had become something of a local legend. On a crisp October evening, with the aspens glowing gold in the sunset, Nathaniel asked Nora to marry him. They stood in the orchard behind her house, the same orchard they had crept through months earlier while fleeing Reynolds. This place has always been special to me, Nathaniel explained as he took her hands in his. Even before that day. When I first came back from the war, lost and haunted by what I'd seen, your father found me sitting here among the apple trees. He didn't ask questions, just sat beside me until the darkness in my mind receded. He offered me work, then guidance, then the chance to buy my own land. He smiled at the memory. And now his daughter has brought light back into my life in a way I never thought possible. He dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring with a modest diamond flanked by two small sapphires. Nora Beaumont, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears glistened in her eyes as she nodded, too overcome to speak at first. When she found her voice, it was clear and certain. Yes, Nathaniel. Yes, with all my heart. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Silver Creek, with Sheriff Wilson giving the bride away and Mrs. Abernathy dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony. Sampson wore a festive red ribbon around his neck and sat obediently at the front pew, as much a part of the family as anyone. The following spring brought new beginnings. Nathaniel and Nora decided to combine their ranches, merging the Keller and Beaumont properties into one thriving operation. They lived in the Beaumont house, which had enough room for the children they hoped would come, while Nathaniel's smaller ranch house became the foreman's residence. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Nora's mother, was born the following winter, a healthy, strong, lunged baby with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Henry, named for the grandfather he would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in the land that would one day be his inheritance. Life wasn't always easy. The Montana winters were harsh, and the work of running a ranch never ended. There were dry seasons that threatened the cattle and wet years when the rivers flooded. But through it all, Nathaniel and Nora faced challenges together, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. On warm summer evenings, they often sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard with Samson's puppies, the old dog having found a mate among one of the neighbor's hounds. Sometimes Nora would read aloud from her latest story, for she had continued her writing, publishing tales of frontier women that found eager readers back east. Nathaniel would listen with pride, occasionally offering suggestions for horseback chase scenes or authentic cowboy dialogue. 10 years to the day after Nathaniel had heard Nora's screams and broken down the barn door, they held a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered to share food and stories, music and laughter echoing across the property. As children raced through the orchard and adults reminisced about the changes the decade had brought. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit around the yard, Nathaniel found Nora standing alone near the old barn, which had been rebuilt and repurposed as a stable for their finest horses. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him with the comfortable familiarity of long-time love. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She turned her face up to his, the years having only enhanced her beauty in his eyes. "I was thinking about that night, how terrified I was, and then how you appeared like something from one of my adventure stories." Her eyes glistened with emotion. "I never imagined then what our lives would become. No regrets about staying in Montana, about choosing this life over Boston." "Not a single one," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." From the yard came the sound of their children's laughter mingling with the music of a fiddle. The stars were emerging in the vast Montana sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children. Nathaniel bent to kiss his wife, as in love with her now as he had been that summer evening on the porch years ago. "I thank God every day that I heard your screams," he murmured against her lips. Nora smiled, her arms encircling his neck. "And I thank God every day that you were brave enough to break down that door." As they walked back to join their guests, hand in hand beneath the star-strewn sky, both knew with absolute certainty that the life they had built together, forged in danger and cultivated with love, was more precious than any oil beneath the soil or gold in the mountains. It was a love story written across the wild Montana landscape, a testament to courage and faith, and it was far from over. Years continued to pass, seasons flowing one into another like the creeks that wound through their property. The Keller children grew tall and strong, Elizabeth becoming a skilled horsewoman who could outride most men in the county, while young Henry showed a talent for ranch management that promised to carry their legacy forward. The promised oil wealth materialized modestly, providing enough security to weather hard times, but never enough to fundamentally change their way of life, for which both Nathaniel and Nora were grateful. The rhythms of ranch life suited them, the honest work and connection to the land forming the backbone of their existence. Nora's writing career flourished alongside her duties as wife, mother, and rancher. Her stories of frontier women facing challenges with courage and intelligence found an eager audience, and her pen name became well known in literary circles back east. Occasionally, she received invitations to speak at women's groups or literary societies in Helena, or even as far as Denver, trips that Nathaniel encouraged her to take, proud of her accomplishments. For his part, Nathaniel became known throughout the territory for his expertise with horses. The Keller Beaumont Ranch specialized in breeding and training quality stock, and buyers came from as far as California to purchase their animals. The quiet, steady cowboy who had once been known primarily as a war veteran had established himself as a respected businessman and community leader. Their love, rather than fading with familiarity, deepened through shared experiences, the joy of watching their children's first steps, the sorrow of burying Samson when the faithful dog finally passed in his sleep at a venerable age, the triumph of surviving a devastating winter that claimed many neighboring herds, the satisfaction of seeing the first oil derrick on their property produce a modest but steady flow. When Elizabeth turned 18, she announced her intention to attend college in Denver, a decision that filled her parents with both pride and trepidation. The night before she was to leave, Nora found Nathaniel sitting on the porch steps, staring pensively at the stars. "She'll be fine," Nora said, settling beside him and taking his hand. "She's got your courage and my common sense." Nathaniel smiled, squeezing her fingers. "It's not that I doubt her abilities. It's just, the world is changing so quickly. Silver Creek has a telephone exchange now. There are automobiles in Helena. What will her world be like? Different from ours," Nora acknowledged. "But the important things remain the same: honor, family, love." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We've given her roots and wings just as we promised we would." As their children grew and eventually found partners of their own, Nathaniel and Nora entered a new phase of life. With more time for themselves, they occasionally indulged in adventures: a trip to Yellowstone to see the geysers, a journey to San Francisco, where Nora was invited to speak at a literary society, even a long-dreamed of visit to Boston, where she showed Nathaniel the city of her youth. But they always returned to the ranch, to the land that had witnessed their love story from its dramatic beginning. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate, filling the old Beaumont house with laughter and new memories. That evening, after the festivities had ended and their family had departed, Nathaniel took Nora's hand and led her to the orchard. The apple trees were in full bloom, their sweet fragrance perfuming the night air. "You remember our wedding night?" he asked, a mischievous gleam in his eyes despite the silver that now threaded his dark hair. Nora blushed, the gesture making her look momentarily like the young woman he had rescued decades earlier. "How could I forget? You carried me across the threshold and then nearly dropped me when Samson decided to race in ahead of us." Nathaniel laughed at the memory. "Not my most graceful moment." His expression softened as he drew her into his arms. 30 years, Nora. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I heard you screaming in that barn. Other times it seems like we've always been together, like my life didn't truly begin until you were in it." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that years of sun and laughter had etched around his eyes. "You saved me that day in more ways than one. You gave me the courage to claim my birthright, to find my voice as a writer, to build a life that honors my father's legacy while creating something uniquely ours." "You saved me too," he countered. "I was existing, not living. Going through the motions, letting the war define me. You showed me there could be more." They stood in the moonlight, surrounded by apple blossoms, the scents and sounds of the Montana night enveloping them. Despite the passing years and changing times, the essential truth of their love remained constant, a rare and precious thing that had begun in danger but flourished in peace. As the century turned and progress accelerated, bringing automobiles and telephones, electric lights and moving pictures to even remote areas like Silver Creek, Nathaniel and Nora watched the world transform around them. Their children embraced these changes. Elizabeth became a teacher who incorporated progressive ideas into her classroom, while Henry modernized the ranch operations with new equipment and techniques. Through it all, the core of their life remained steady: their love for each other, their connection to the land, the values they had instilled in their children and now shared with their grandchildren. The barn where Nathaniel had first found Nora eventually had to be torn down and rebuilt, but they kept one of the original beams, mounting it above the fireplace in their home as a reminder of their beginning. In their later years, as their hair whitened and their steps slowed, they sometimes reminisced about that fateful night, marveling at how a moment of terror had led to a lifetime of joy. Their grandchildren begged for the story again and again, thrilling to the drama of their grandfather breaking down the barn door to rescue their grandmother. "And then he said, 'She's free now,' in the bravest voice I'd ever heard," Nora would recount, her eyes meeting Nathaniel's across the room, communicating volumes in a single glance. "You make me sound like some kind of hero," he would protest with a chuckle. "You were," she would insist. "You are." On the 50th anniversary of that night, when both were in their 70s, they sat together on the porch of the home they had shared for decades, watching the sun set over the land they had nurtured and protected. Nathaniel's hands, once strong enough to break down a barn door, were now gnarled with arthritis, but still gentle as they held Nora's. "You ever wonder how different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden by the barn that evening?" he asked. Nora considered the question, her face thoughtful beneath the silver crown of her hair. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my father once told me, that the most important moments in our lives often come disguised as ordinary decisions. You could have ignored those screams. You could have ridden for the sheriff instead of acting yourself. I could have returned to Boston after the trial. We both made choices that led us here." Nathaniel nodded, understanding as always. "The best choice I ever made was asking you to marry me in this orchard. And the best choice I ever made was saying yes." She squeezed his hand, her voice softening. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best," he agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, two figures silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the house. Behind them lay decades of memories: children born and raised, challenges faced and overcome, joy and sorrow shared in equal measure. Before them stretched the legacy they would leave: not just the prosperous ranch or Nora's published works, but the example of a love that had begun with an act of courage and grown into something enduring and true. The Montana night enclosed them, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky above. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the land that had witnessed their love story from beginning to end. And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the world they had shaped together, Nathaniel and Nora knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be: free and beloved. Their lives an unending testament to that night when a cowboy heard screams in a barn and chose to act, setting in motion a love story that would span generations.